Thank you for joining us for Everything Under the Sun, the AccuWeather podcast. I'm your host, meteorologist Regina Miller, joined in the studio, as always, by my producer, Andy Robb, and my director of audio services, Ken Prow. And this week, guys, we are talking about the blizzard of 1993.
Storm of the century.
Storm of the century. I've heard it called Snowicane. Storm, really, it's almost biblical proportions because at one point in time, I was talking to Bernie Rayno. He's our chief meteorologist on the AccuWeather network. So we were chatting this morning. He was here during that storm. At one point, it stretched all the way from Canada to Cuba. The tail end of this front caused severe damage in Cuba.
That's crazy to think about.
Incredibly high winds.
Right. And then the other thing was, at one point, there was snow falling from Caribou, Maine to Atlanta.
Wow.
You know, so this was just a huge storm. What were you guys doing at the time of the storm?
I was a junior in high school and don't remember anything about that storm whatsoever.
Junior.
Exactly.
All you cared about was what you were doing that weekend, you know? Where are we going this weekend, guys?
Yep.
What about you, Andy?
I was in second grade, and
God.
I remember 96 a lot more than 93, but around here where the AccuWeather headquarters is, central Pennsylvania, really got hammered and
really
a lot of snow, and you were here at that time.
Well, I wasn't. I actually, this was when I was a stay-at-home mom, actually a brand new mom. So the interesting part for me was I was pregnant with my daughter, and she was due during the storm. Is when
No way.
when I was supposed to have her. Fortunately, we went early because I said later on.
She didn't want to miss the storm.
She didn't want to miss the storm. Well, I had said there was a state of emergency in Pennsylvania, so I had said to someone, what would I have done? Because there were no vehicles able to get through, which you're going to hear some of the stories coming up. But they said, well, you would have had to hitch a ride with like a PennDOT plow truck or something to get to the hospital.
Yeah.
Like, it was crazy.
Yeah.
Right. So up next, we are going to be talking to several of our meteorologists that actually worked through the storm, and it was quite an effort to even get here. And we'll hear their stories, so stay with us. Well, today I'm joined in the studio by some of my favorite people who have joined me on the AccuWeather podcast before. I'm with recently retired Chief Meteorologist Elliot Abrams, also Paul Pastelok, our long-range meteorologist, and Dave Dombek, our meteorologist who's been here many occasions. And today, guys, we are talking about the storm of the century, the blizzard of 1993 that occurred from Friday, March 12th through Sunday, March 14th. So thanks for sitting down with me today, guys.
Our pleasure.
Yeah.
Same here.
I'm looking forward to
This
this.
is exciting.
I get your drift.
You get my he's already but anyway, we were talking even before we went on the podcast here about some of our memories, and so I thought we would start off by talking about, because not only do we have our memories of forecasting this, but actually of living through it, because it was a crazy storm. And so tell me a little bit, and any one of you can jump in, about what you remember about the evolution of this storm, because we'll try and kind of talk about how it was set up at first, how it evolved, and then we can tell what happened to each of us, because we all have some crazy stories.
One of the things I really remember about this is how well advertised this was, and how confident we were in our forecasts. And we had a lot less information, a lot less model information back then than we do today. Much
Right, because
less.
it's 93, so it wasn't like you had all the computer models.
Right.
Because there was some challenges back then.
Yeah,
to do these kind of
and
forecasts.
just the pattern, the way that's set up, the long wave patterns and everything, we had a lot of confidence that this was going to be a big, powerful, and very devastating storm over a large area 4 or 5 days out. And I distinctly remember being on the radio. Back then I did a lot of radio, and I remember probably having the most bold wording in a radio forecast that I could ever remember. Basically not saying like la-di-da, roads will be slippery for travel, that kind of stuff. Be careful out there. Roads are going to be closed, period, with this.
Right, because there were state emergencies in numerous states. But what was impressive to me was the size of this thing, because you had some people called it the snowicane, but you had that winter blizzard storm in the north, but then we also had severe weather in the south.
It was one of the largest storms that I can ever remember seeing in terms of area that being affected. And the European model, this was when the European model I think became famous, because it had a good handle on this storm many days in advance. The U.S. model, in fact, there was a paper written by the National Weather Service about it, critiquing their own model, talking about how that one had not captured the strength of the storm because of a problem with the physics in the model at the time. But the European model did a very good job. That it had a bullseye storm just coming right along. There were a few changes that came in later, such as that made it sleet and for a while along the East Coast, holding down the snow amounts. But this was a spectacular storm.
I was the severe weather monitor back then. We had one person that was in charge of all clients that dealt with wind and rain and tidal flooding and stuff. And I was the only one that made it in. I was the only one there for almost 12 consecutive hours.
Were you like the closest one, Paul? Are you living the closest, or how did you get here?
No, I walked in.
Oh, you walked in?
It was about a mile and a half. I walked in and got into the studio, got in there and noticed there was hardly anybody there, and sat down in my chair and just started doing all the severe. The thing about this storm, it just wasn't snow. I mean, we had tornadoes in Florida. We had high winds on the Carolina coast. I think there was a gust over 90 miles an hour there. We had to make sure all those clients were covered as well. And in addition, it was such a large storm, like you guys were saying. They said about 40% of Americans were affected by this system.
Right. Well, that's the amazing thing. Like, I just have a couple of the impacts here, like that I had written down. So there were over 300 people killed. We had tornadoes, hurricane wind gusts in the south. Some of those wind gusts, for example, 109 mile per hour wind gust in Key West. Myrtle Beach had that 90 mile per hour wind gust, and in the Florida Panhandle, as the storm was going over 100 mile per hour wind gust reported there, plus some tornadoes that they had, and then we had the heavy snowfall.
And we had record low pressure.
Yes.
With that, we had pressures that got as low or lower than you would see in a hurricane.
The lowest pressure was 960 millibars, 28.35 inches, and there was lots of records set in New England when the storm really fully, started in the Gulf and then came all the way up to New England. So. And
with the effects on the coast, there was massive flooding, tidal flooding, and flooding in times of high tide, and the water could not get back out of the bays because the storm was still there. It took so long for it to go by. And over inland areas, the snow, I mean, there were car capturing, bus blocking, SUV stalling drifts, and truck trapping ones too, and you just couldn't go anywhere. I actually slept in the AccuWeather building overnight during the storm because we weren't able to leave. Our younger son was also working at AccuWeather at the time, and he slept at the same office.
Only one lane down Atherton Street the next morning. Here in State College, it's our main road. They only plowed one path down the middle because they couldn't put the snow anywhere. It was so bad. And like Elliot, I stayed all night, and I slept in our vice president's office on the floor for an hour. I think that's all I could leave an hour.
Our vice president was here a little bit earlier, Evan Myers, and I was like, "Were you doing like a George Costanza under the desk there?"
Yeah,
and you're just gonna he comes
out,
in,
but there was hardly any room to do anything in there, so I just went on the floor. So I said, "I'm crashing for an hour," and then somebody woke me up and came back in. So.
Yeah, back in the old building, we were like sardines in there. You'd back your chair up and you were bumping into somebody. That's
right.
We were in an
tight spaces.
Old church. It was tight. I mean,
Yep.
it was tight space, and that was. Guys, that was I wasn't even here a full year, and I get hit with the biggest storm.
It's trial by fire, boy.
I mean,
you really
I got
jumped
thrown
into
right
it.
in,
Right.
It's unbelievable. So
That's how you started building your great reputation.
You did. That's what happens in these big storms.
let me tell you, one thing about this system too, it had an incredible warm front, that coastal warm front that pushed back, and the convection. It was thunderstorms just popping up on the east side of that warm front constantly. And I had to draw all those. Back then, we had to draw things on our things that we faxed out.
You couldn't fit the isobars.
I had to keep not the isobar. I was trying to draw all the little thunderstorms. There were so many of them. That was just a pain there alone, just drawing all that stuff, and then to keep up with all the every hour forecast, sending things out. But then I started getting to the point. It's like, is anybody even working right now? I mean, seriously. I mean, I think everybody's like gone and
Right.
bunkering in. Yeah.
Do you guys remember how low the visibility was right at the height of that storm? Like locally here in State College, it was like mid to late afternoon. You could not see. What do you think the visibility was at that time?
Except then with thunder and lightning.
Maybe 50 yards at
50
best.
yards, right. It was less than a football field for sure. Maybe 50 yards, 40 yards. The combination of the heavy snow falling and the powerful winds and all the drifting going on and the blowing snow. I remember that afternoon. At that time, we lived on the west side of Bellefonte between the University Park Airport and Bellefonte on Seibert Road. Very open, very exposed to wind.
Oh, so the winds were
that.
just blowing the snow and drifting
Oh,
it
was
against
crazy out there.
everything.
Yeah,
The winds were so strong that if the wind picked up a snowflake over State College, it might not reach the ground until it got to the Atlantic Ocean.
Probably.
That afternoon, I remember seeing my neighbor, and I saw him out there like 3 different times shoveling his driveway before it got really bad. And I was thinking to myself, John,
This is useless. This is futile.
yeah, I was thinking to myself, John, if you only knew how bad it was going to be later
Right.
today. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And I remember the last vehicle I saw on our road, on Seibert Road, was about 1:30 in the afternoon. We saw a plow go through, and that was it. We did not see the next vehicle I saw was about 10:30 on Sunday morning. The next morning was a bulldozer coming down, cutting a 1-lane path down our road. There were
Because that's the only way they could do it
And
was
that
with bulldozers.
That was only for emergency purposes,
Right.
right? We were still
Right.
not allowed to be on the roads.
there was an eight
Right, that's right. There was a state of emergency. All traffic was told, you weren't allowed to be on the road.
And in terms
eight
of
to-
school closings around then, we're naming the places that was open.
They were open,
Because
right?
there were only a handful of places open, and if they read all the closings, they'd have had no time to give any other programming.
Right,
They had
right.
school closings, I think, all the way down to Florida because they got 4 inches in the Panhandle.
My shoveling story was actually non-participation at that time. I was still stranded at the building, and when I realized we were going to be able to leave, I called home and asked my wife if she could possibly shovel a small path out through the driveway. And of course, you can imagine her joy at receiving that call. But she tried to do that, and we had a small dog at the time, a Chihuahua Terrier mix. And she was only about 8 inches high, and I think she was quite terrorized by the depth of the snow because they couldn't see out of it, couldn't climb over it. And in the downtown area, the snow is actually up to the heads of the parking meters. If you can imagine a parking meter with the thing where you put your money in, it was up to that point. I'd never seen that before.
Wow. It was, well, and I have some snowfall amounts here because, just for reference, for example, in Syracuse, there was 43 inches of snow. 35 inches of that fell in 24 hours.
Mm-hmm.
So think, when you think about how fast and hard that snow is coming down, you mentioned in the South, Birmingham, Alabama, 18 inches just north of the city. So 18 inches of snow in Alabama, and then Pittsburgh was 25 inches, 56 in Tennessee, and that was Mount LeConte, I think is how you pronounce that.
But keep in mind, too, there was the amounts. We've seen bigger storms for the 95 corridor. They didn't get as much. I mean, they got a foot.
Around a foot,
Yeah.
and they had some sleet. They had it mixed for a time.
This
there.
is a total Appalachian system.
This was an Appalachian storm.
I mean-
28 inches in State College, I believe was the and
Official.
we on top of that we had gusts 60 to 65 mile per hour.
Yeah, I couldn't.
And
when I went home to try to, afterwards to shovel off, my car, I didn't know which one was mine. It was all completely covered.
yeah.
I didn't know where my car was.
Well,
I couldn't remember.
it would look like sand dunes.
Yeah,
It
that's all it
wouldn't
was.
even look like cars. It would look like what I remember.
Well, you couldn't see the cars.
You couldn't see the
gone.
cars. That's what I mean. So it would.
So you didn't know which
it's
one
kind of like just dunes or something.
Yeah, you
when
didn't
you're
know which
looking
one
out.
to brush off. I just
Right.
started brushing every one off because I didn't know which one was.
so I have
start
an
brushing a car out, and suddenly you realize it's not yours.
It's not yours. You did somebody else a favor, but
Yeah, I have an opposite story. Like Paul was stranded here, and Elliot was stranded here. I was at home. I was off that day. That's Saturday, Friday night, Saturday. I had to work Sunday. And so it took me, and we don't have a big driveway, or we didn't at the time. It took me probably 2.5 hours to shovel out of my driveway to get out onto that path that the bulldozer had cut on our
The
on Seibert Road.
bulldozer, yeah.
Then I had, at that time, I had a full-size pickup truck and four-wheel drive and good tires. So I said, okay, I'm going into work. I'm on my way. So I get out onto Seibert Road, and I'm going down. It was like going through a tunnel.
Yeah.
It was so narrow. I was literally. It was a full size, not a smaller like a Chevy S10.
So both
I was
sides
scraping,
are like walls.
I was
Both sides
scraping.
were-
I was scraping the snowbanks on either side every now and then. I get out to Rock Road. That's oriented northwest to southeast, and that the winds were blowing northwest. It was pretty much parallel, so that was open. It was snow covered, but it was open because the winds were blowing parallel to the road. Then I make the right turn. I go an eighth of a mile down the road, and there's this huge mountain of snow right on the road.
Oh
They
my
had
gosh.
must have cleaned off the runways
Yep.
and no place to dump it, and they dumped it right there.
Oh.
So I couldn't. I had to back up, put it into reverse, back up.
So you
winds
had to
around by
reverse
Spring
just to
Creek,
get out of there.
just to get out of there, go down, eventually wind my way out to College Ave and into town there. And I made it, and I was here for whatever, 12 hours,
So you're
13
saying-
hours.
So you're saying if you had a pair of skis, you would have been better.
Yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely. But
Yeah.
it was, what a feeling, going down the road. There's this huge mound. I mean,
But it was cold.
they
Afterwards-
just dumped all the snow from the runways of University Park Airport.
Just
They
dumped
just
it there.
dumped it right on
Well,
Fox
they're
Hill
like
Road.
they were thinking nobody's going to be on the road.
Nobody's going to be
They
on the
didn't
road.
account for you.
not some goofball from AccuWeather.
Right.
Well, after the fact, there was speculation about why such a large storm had been able to develop. And one idea at that time, and I don't think anyone can actually prove this, was that it was part of the effect left over from the eruption of the major volcano Pinatubo in 1991. There were spectacular sunsets and sunrises visible just about everywhere around the world right after the volcano, and it caused some cooling. Mm-hmm. And for example, one that erupted in 1815 led to the year without a summer, 1816, in New England, where there was frost and snow in each of the months. So here was this cooling taking place, interruption in the overall warming process, and then this large storm. Now today, we would actually think that the large storm actually could be associated with warming,
Right.
because the larger storms are able to gather more moisture. There's more moisture in the air than there was, say, 20, 30, 40 years ago because of warming. The atmosphere can accommodate more water vapor when it's warm than when it's cold. And so there's all that more fuel to fuel a storm like this. That's what has been attributed. Many of the recent floods and severe storms have been attributed to that effect.
Oh, okay.
And the research has shown that some of these big volcanoes eruptions, the pattern can be affected for 2 to 3 years afterwards. So even though it happened in 91, right?
Right.
Right.
The storm happened in 93, so it can have an effect on
Yeah.
it. So.
Right. And, we talked about the fact that, there wasn't necessarily as much snow because it changed over with sleet and, mixed there along the I-95. But even those wind gusts, like I have some of the wind gusts from there, Fire Island, New York, 89 mile per hour wind gust, 81 miles per hour in Boston, 66 miles per hour gust in Philadelphia. So just the power of that storm itself, on top of the fact that some of those places had 10 to maybe 12 inches of snow.
The good thing with that wind was that it was not in the summertime during hurricane season, because with the trees in leaf,
Oh, right.
so many of them would have been blown down. Like with Hazel in 1954, hundreds of thousands of trees in Pennsylvania were blown down by that storm. And the winds weren't any stronger in that than they were from this. In fact, probably a little weaker. But since the trees were barren, they didn't offer as much resistance to the wind, and so this did not create that much of a trouble. And there was fewer power outages than you might have thought, because in the area with the heaviest snow was powdery snow, and there was so much wind it didn't really accumulate on the wires.
Yeah, and in addition,
okay.
Elliot, if you remember that pattern that winter, I think there were some snows that had occurred earlier in February earlier that winter that were there were wetter snows, and they did cause some tree and limb damage. And I think a lot of the weak limbs in that were already gone from some of those trees, and so you didn't. You didn't have as much. It was amazing.
Natural pruning.
Yeah, natural pruning, and it was amazing that we never lost power.
That is amazing.
We were burning wood at the time. It heated the whole house, and we were fine. We were ready.
You were prepared for it,
but
right.
we never lost our power. As unbelievable as that is.
I don't think we did either.
And
because
thank
I
goodness
wasn't-
Hardee's didn't either.
Because that's where you ended up walking
It was the
to.
only restaurant that was open thanks to
Can
our
you imagine
good
if
buddy
you-
Elliot Abrams
And
here.
dummy here, send him out to get them.
Yeah,
Can you imagine,
he
though?
sent out a pack.
And you can't imagine their joy when I asked them if they would
Didn't
do
you have a
this.
chain like hooked up to you on your
Listen,
on your
we
leg
had- we had
in
no
case you didn't make it
chains so
back?
we
We
could
came
drag
so
it back
prepared. We had no money. We had a vending machine in the other room, and it was garbage. And we had nothing to eat. And Elliot says, "Well, go down to Hardee's," and I'm like, "It's not going to be open." So we did anyway. So we took a walk down I think it was 4 or 5 of us. We got down to Hardee's, and they're actually digging out. They were digging out
Oh
the
my
one side.
God.
Forget the other side; it was completely covered. But we got in on the one side, and I said, "You guys open?" "We're open for business," and I'm like, "Yes."
Can you imagine being an employee at Hardee's that has to go to work?
It was the owner and one other person.
Oh, okay,
We had
'cause I
to
was
wait a
gonna
while, and in
say.
fact, I was offering to help them out if they wanted to, but it was.
I'll work for roast beef sandwiches.
I know. We just
You're the salt on the fries guy, right?
Well, they got a little bit nervous because they thought they saw 4 of us, but then we ordered for everybody, and they're like, "Are you kidding me?" And
my
I'm like,
God.
"We got to eat."
Well, and we want to make it worthwhile. You guys are open.
Well,
so.
Elliot slipped us some money over there. I
my
said, "If
God.
Elliot's buying, yes, we're gonna take advantage of this."
Well, this storm, can you guys just explain to me, because we kind of didn't break it down, but can you explain the dynamics that just created this monster?
Well, you had a huge high pressure area in place first, a massive area of cold air
And dry air.
and dry air.
Yep.
And then you had this much stronger than average system in the upper atmosphere, along with a very strong jet stream. And they both happened to develop at exactly the same time. Mm-hmm. And so the storm just had a huge area to capture moisture from the Gulf of Mexico, the Atlantic off the East Coast. And the pressure difference between the storm and the high pressure to the north helped generate the very strong winds.
Right, and I think the fact that, a lot of these storms we see, they're a smaller scale, the short wave or the disturbance aloft that causes the surface storm might be, covering a small portion of the country or over. This was a classic, what we would call a full latitude, or in Dr. Joel Myers's words, a full latitude trough.
Yes.
It was. I mean, it covered such a huge area. It was a classic, what you would call a full latitude trough, and everything just came together in just almost a perfect, a textbook case. That what you would.
Every
if you had
ingredient that
if
you would
had
have
to
to
get all
add.
your ingredients together to form this monster storm.
That was it.
That was it.
Amazing storm. So the storm of the century was appropriate, you think?
Absolutely.
The storm of biblical proportions,
Biblical proportions.
as one of our forecasters put on
And
a
the
trucking
depth,
map.
was a testament to that.
And it started, and I get hit with the biggest storm that started my career.
And being a weather weenie, I mean, you love storms, you love all kind of crazy weather. And I remember right at the height of that storm, I heard this flapping noise, like this banging and flapping. And I was like, "Oh no, is our siding loose?" So I bundled up. I went outside around the side of the house, and I saw it was actually our neighbor's house. I think they were aware of it, but I made sure I called them and let them know. But I was out literally for like 5 minutes, and maybe 15 feet from the house, and that was at the height of the storm with the visibility, the wind, and it was scary. I mean, and
Yeah, it's
I'm a
downright
weather wing.
scary.
I love crazy, and I was actually scared to be outside. It's like I was very glad when I got inside. Being outside
And we
for
were
just
glad
a
that
short.
we'd use all that wording in the forecast before about how it would be impossible to get through, the roads would be closed. It wasn't just slippery driving
No.
conditions or hazardous. This was a disaster.
Right.
You pulled out the stops. You were as bold as you could possibly be with the wording. in
As
our
it was
forecasts.
coming up the coast, I actually had another scare. Our older son had been over in England, part of something he was doing during that semester, and he was coming back at the time of the storm. We didn't even think their plane would take off. It was supposed to go to Philadelphia. And when they saw what the storm was doing in Philadelphia, they diverted it to Charlotte. And I hear that, and I'm looking at the satellite picture on the radar, and that's where all the thunderstorms are headed.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Now, they made it in, but it was not a very pleasant waiting period.
Right. Well, I know I was looking also behind this. Once it swept through, I was checking out some of the temperatures. We had temperatures below freezing all the way down. I think 21 Fahrenheit in Mobile, 31 degrees in Daytona. So then right behind it, it was just
See, that's-
And this is just before, a week before spring.
frigid.
You're talking about following the system, or
Following the system right
Well,
behind it.
Yeah, this is the blessing of this whole storm. Like we were talking about earlier, the power outages were limited. There wasn't many at all. Can you imagine? I mean, all that cold that came in on the backside, pipes freezing, bursting.
And people couldn't even go out to get to a shelter that may have heat.
We had a lot of deaths from the storm itself. Can you imagine what could have happened?
Good
after?
point. Good
Right.
point. Yeah.
True.
So-
True. Well, it's been very interesting getting your perspective on this, guys. I always enjoy talking to you.
Thanks, Regina. Really enjoyed this.
Yeah, thanks, Regina.
Great job, Regina, as always, and thank you.
Well, thanks again to our guest, Elliot Abrams, the recently retired chief meteorologist here at AccuWeather, for coming back in, and also Dave Dombek, our meteorologist on the floor, and long-range meteorologist Paul Pastelok.
And of course, a big thanks to Paul for going out in the harsh conditions to get those burgers.
Do you
for
think he'll run
everybody.
out and get us a burger right now?
I don't
'Cause
know.
I'm kind of hungry.
Yeah,
You
maybe.
get me a burger.
Paul, come back.
I wasn't here. I missed the burgers. I would rather be here just to get the burgers.
So before we take off for today, just wanted to let you know that we have a brand new daily podcast called Weather Insider.
That's right, with Evan Myers, our COO, and from the AccuWeather TV network, Bernie Reno.
Both of which have appeared on our weekly podcast multiple times.
Yeah, giving you the top trending weather stories of the day, breaking everything down for you.
Right. So check that out and check us out again here next week for our 50th episode.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Be sure to subscribe to AccuWeather's Everything Under the Sun, giving you the stories behind the weather and so much more. New episodes every Thursday. Just search for AccuWeather on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or visit AccuWeather.com/podcast.